All right, I think we're ready to get started again. So good discussion so far. So thanks for everybody's questions, comments, feedback. We appreciate the active engagement. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to get into those comparative examples that we've referenced throughout the day. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to James to start walking through the first example.
Welcome back, everybody, and welcome back to settlements here. So in order to do a better job of comparing all of the changes, we decided to stick with the 4BA example, and then we published out an addendum example that is more based on a network model that we've kind of built so that it has more interactions with constraints and setting transfer revenue and so on. We'll talk about that one if we can, but let's walk through the two examples of 4 BAAs, one with prevailing flow, one with a counter flow. Each BAA, as I said last time, they passed their RC, they had enough supply fit in to meet the demand. The BAA transfer constraints are not binding, so there is no transfer revenue. That means that the marginal energy cost is going to be the same across the entire footprint. We do have a single constraint in BAA that's binding. It's binding from a south to north direction. The shadow price in that constraint has impacts all the way across the footprint. In the prevailing flow, the energy dispatch from generation to meet the overall demand is flowing south to north, so it's going in the prevailing direction. But we also have created this counterflow example that has energy in a middle BAA, which is BAC, that is supplying both in the prevailing direction for BAD, but also in a counterflow direction to serve BAB. Now, in the counterflow example, I know we'll have some discussion about the pricing. And Steve, I do recognize here that I should have changed BAD's price from $19 to $20 or $21 based on the fact that is BAC that is solving the congestion. It was a mistake on my part, and I hope we can discuss this without getting too much detail there. Now, if we go to the next slide, here's the setup for, and we've seen this before, of the prevailing flow. We have the generation being dispatched across the market. BAA, we have a binding constraint. The generation in BAA is serving the load in BAA, but I have generation in BAB that's being dispatched that'll serve load in BAC and BAD. Now, there's a table here that goes through all the settlement. Last time we went line by line through settlement. We're going to skip that this time. We'll go to the next slide. I did a little summary on congestion revenue, where it's collecting, and then the next slide will be how we're distributing it. In the collection, as I said, there's a single constraint binding in BAA. I have 4,000 megawatts of generation in BAA in the south that is serving 4,000 megawatts in the north. This is generating $124,000 of net congestion revenue. I have 200 megawatts of generation in BAB that is scheduled to serve 200 megawatts of load in BAC. This generates $6,000 of net congestion revenue. Of that, there's also a 100 megawatt OAT transaction that is being self-scheduled from the generator to serve that load. That means there's a CRN defined for the generator to the transfer point, and then from the transfer point to the load. This flow of energy from the generator to the load is generate $3,000 of congestion revenue. This is the congestion revenue that is going to be impacted by the draft final proposal. The other 200 megawatts of generation in BAB that has been scheduled is serving load in BAD. The price differential means I'm collecting $5,800 worth of net congestion revenue. Now, we go to the next slide. What that means is across the EDAM footprint, we've collected $135,800 of congestion revenue. Now it's going to be determined how do we distribute that. Under the current EDAM tariff design, that $135,800 would go all the way to BAA. This is the BAA where the constraint's binding, and so under the current EDAM design, all of that congestion revenue would go to there. In the transitional design, it's going to be broken up. I'm going to have $3,800 in BAD. I'm going to have $4,000 in BAC, $4,000 in BAB, and then the $124,000 in BAA. That's because you are collecting it. If we want to go back, do you want to see what the dollars are? Go back to. Okay. So in this diagram, where we see the tables where the highlighted bolded values, under that traditional measure that we did to the issue paper, each of these BAs would have this portion of the congestion revenue distributed to it. So of the $135,800, I'd have $124,000 in BAA, $4,000 BAB, $4,000 BAC, $3,800 BAD. Now that's so that we've moved off of that, and that was going too far because we're giving all of the congestion back to the BA where it materialized. So under the revised transitional approach, we're looking at the OAT. This is going to be the 100 megawatts that has been self-scheduled from BAB to serve load in BAC. This will have a CRN, or CRN could be up to 200, 300 megawatts. They're only exercising 100 megawatts of self-scheduling. Okay, so what that translates to, and if we go back down 2 slides. Okay, so what it translates to is that BAB is going to get $1,000 of congestion revenue distributed to it. That represents the 100 megawatts of OAT schedule times the negative $10 marginal cost congestion price. BAC will get $2,000 because that'll represent the $20 of marginal cost congestion price times the 100 megawatts that was self-scheduled for OAT. The rest, which is the 132,800, that balance is going over to the balancing authority where the constraint is binding, and that's so BAA. So we are retaining the concept of the original EDAM proposal, saying if I'm not exercising my rights, that congestion revenue goes back to the BA where the constraint is modeled. However, if you are exercising your rights, then we will calculate the amount of congestion hedge associated with that OAT schedule and provide it to the entity for them to give the hedge to their customers. This same mechanism applies to ETC tours, except the ISO will give it to the customers directly. Now, I'm going to open this up for quick questions on the prevailing flow. I went real quickly. Oh, sorry. One more slide. The comparative slide. So, as you see, I just described basically how it was set up. So, in the congestion offset for BAA, the original design would have 135,800 going to BAA, nothing to BAB, BAC, BAD. In the transitional measure, as we described before, there was a distribution, 124,000 BAA, 4,000 BAB, 4,000 BAC, 3,800 BAD. Under the new design, the revised design, 132,800 goes to BAA. We have 1,000, which is associated with the OAT, will go to BAB for distribution, and then BAC will get $2,000 for distribution. BAD gets nothing because they didn't have any OAT schedule. Now I'll open up for questions.
Any questions for James on this example?
Okay.
Nope.
Now the
Steve?
one that gave
Okay.
everybody a little
Steve?
heartburn. Let's see. Okay.
One question, the OAT transmission that you're talking about here is actually not within either of the two BAAs. It's transferred between the two BAAs, correct?
It's within and between. So they have a generator, they have rights to get to the transfer point. And then it could be, these could be two separate CRNs that could have a bilateral agreement, or it could be the same CRN. So I have one contract that says I've got the rights to get from the generator to the transfer point. And then I have another contract that says, as a load customer, that I have the right to get it from the transfer point to my load.
Okay.
So I'm going to give them the congestion reversal for those two legs.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm not seeing any other, oh, we do have one popped up. Jeff, go ahead.
Thanks, James. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. I was just going to follow on to the previous question, and I think you answered it partly, but I just wanted to clarify. So under the assumption that the OAT delivery from BA, B to C is two different transmission providers, one that's providing the service exporting, from the generator to the export of the first BA, and then the other is providing service from the import to the load. Does that mean that from the customer's point of view, they have basically four settlements? Like there's a balanced schedule where there's an injection at the generator location and a withdrawal at the export, and that's the first segment, and then there's the second segment that's the import into the next BA and a withdrawal at the load location, and those could be the same contract or two different contracts, but there's kind of four different settlements associated with the two segments of transmission?
Not necessarily. So there's going to be two binding settlements and two financial accounting settlements. So for the binding, it's going to be a generator and the load, because the agreement is to get the generation to the load. At the transfer location, we're not going to have a financially settlement of the transfer, but I am going to account for it from a congestion perspective and energy perspective offsets. But I am going to take into consideration the congestion exposure, because since the transfers are settling pretty much at the marginal energy cost, then the cost for that supply, once we provide that, once the hedge is provided, is going to be marginal energy to marginal energy. So there isn't the generator is basically getting paid for the marginal energy cost. And then the load is going to be settled for the marginal energy cost.
Okay, I think where I'm maybe not as clear then is on how, if you've got two different BAs that are each providing transmission service, and the requirement is for the schedules to be balanced, how does that look? How would the
Okay.
Do you know what I'm
So
saying?
on the
How would the
trans-
transmission in BAB be balanced if it's only settled on the gen and not at the tie location?
Okay, because in order for the execution of the transfer, the transmission customer would also have to have rights at the transfer associated with the CRN. So if they are scheduling their rights, they'll schedule the rights from the generator to the transfer point. And then if it's the same transmission customer, he'll schedule the mirror to the load. When settlements will settle it, the binding settlement will be on the generation and the load. But I have the association from the transmission customer, from the generator to the export transfer. That tells me that BA's balanced quantity. And then I will apply the hedge to it. And then when the mirror transfer resource, will also have a CRN. That's going to be the same CRN as the load. So now I'm able to balance the CRNs between the import transfer to the load, and they will get the congestion revenue hedge for that.
Okay, I think I was following along partly with that, but it might be useful to down the road have an example that is more tailored to the settlement of the customer rather than just the BAs, just to help clarify what that looks like, especially because there's a little bit of complexity there with the mirrors and things like that. And I think it'd be useful to understand that a little bit better.
So if we look through the table and the prevailing flow, you'll see that I have transfer going from TBC, that is defined as out. And then the transfer BC in the BAC section, that is out scheduled transfers. So that says I have a generator going to the transfer point, and then from the transfer point to the load. I'll point that out on the counterflow example so that it's clear.
Okay, thanks, James.
Okay, I think that's a good.
George is clarifying something for me. So Jeff, the way he's seeing it is 4 settlements is you settle the generator, you settle the load at the LMP, you refund the generator, refund the load for the congestion. I see them as together, so that's a visualization difference.
All right, Steve, did you have a question? Okay. All right, so I think we can switch gears to the next example then.
All right, so I'll walk a little slower through the counterflow. And so if we go to the next slide. So in the counterflow example, all right, I have still the same 4 BAs, same constraints binding. The difference is that the BAC has generation that's cheaper than BAB and BAD, and it's being dispatched to serve load. I'm still maintaining that BAB has a transmission customer that is self-scheduling its OAT rights to get from the generator to the transfer point, and that is corresponding to either his own or another contract that is going from the transfer point to the load. So what that looks like and where you can see it is as we're looking at the table, you see generation, then you'll see load, and if you look at BAB, you'll see generation OAT. That is the cost of the generator for self-scheduling its 100 megawatts. The LMP is $1,000 because it was $20. The congestion was -10. So the marginal energy cost was $2,000. The congestion was a minus a payment or a charge of $1,000. sorry. The transfer is TBC with the parentheses as O. That means they scheduled at the transfer, they submitted a self-schedule exporting out 100 megawatts from BAB. That cost is $2,000. That is just the marginal energy cost because the transfers are not going to reflect any physical congestion. In BAC, I have load that's being served. That load is being charged $4,000. Of that is what those $2,000 of congestion. But if you look farther down, there's also that mirror transfer resource that says $2,000 was paid to the import transfer or accounted for the import transfer as the marginal energy cost. This OAT transaction is identified to me by using the same contract reference number. So now I can see that I have energy that is coming from a generator that is going to the transfer location in BAB, and I need to now look at the congestion difference between those two transactions. In this case, for BAB, it's $1,000. For BAC, I have load that's being served. It got charged $2,000. The supply side for BAC is the transfer import. It was paid at $2,000, but it had no congestion. So now when I look at the balance schedule, still 100 megawatts, it's $2,000 that I now have to take in consideration for our current draft final proposal. So I'm going to go through in more detail, like a summary of what the congestion is on the next slide. As I said, it's a single constraint in BAA that causes physical congestion across the footprint. Same as the prevailing flow for BAA, I still have 4,000 megawatts of generation in the south that is serving 4,000 megawatts in the north. It's still generating $124,000 of congestion revenue. In BAB, I have 100 megawatts of OAT generation that is serving 100 megawatts of load in BAC. That's generating $3,000 of congestion revenue. Yep. Sorry, I had to look at that real quickly. For BAC, I have an additional 600 megawatts that is scheduled to meet load in BAB. You know, from a transfer perspective, it's a net 500, but that 600 is counterflowing against the 100 megawatt of OAT self-schedule. That generates $18,000 of net congestion rent. And then for BAC that is going to BAD, because I didn't adjust the pricing, I'm having 200 megawatts of generation serving 200 megawatts of load. It generated $1 per megawatt of congestion rent, so $200 of congestion rent overall. Now we go to the next slide. That nets out to $108,800 of net collected congestion revenue. So now how are we going to distribute it? Under the current distribution, it goes to the BA where the constraint is modeled. Under the original transitional approach, we put it to the BA where the congestion materialized. For the revised, we're putting the OAT congestion back to the BAs where the OAT congestion materialized. And the remaining will go to the BA where the constraint is modeled. Now, if we go to the next slide, it actually shows you where the dollars went. So in the original EDAM design, we have $108,800 that is overall congestion revenue collected. It's being paid to BAA. Under the transitional approach as part of the issue paper, as we said before, we were looking for the congestion where it materialized. So in this case, I had $124,000 that went to payment to BAA. Since my generation was dispatched more than my load, there was $5,000 of congestion rent that had to be collected in order to make that BAA balance. So it was $5,000 charged to BAB. The BAC, there was $14,000 that was going to have to be collected and from that BAA to account for the overall generation dispatched. And BAD, I collected $3,800. Under the refined approach, what we have done is we looked at the BAA where the OATS transactions are balanced, as we talked about before. So it's $1,000 for BAB. I have $2,000 for BAC. Now, what that means is I've reduced the amount of money in BAA from $108,800 to $105,800 because those the OAT transition customer exercised its OAT rights. Now I'm going to open it back up for more questions.
All right. Thanks, James. We'll give it a minute. Any questions for James on the second counterflow example? Steve.
Yeah, Steve Keen, Southern California Edison. If you can go back to, I guess it's page 31. This one, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I am a little bit troubled because I see there's 400 megawatts of power flowing from BAC to BAAB. But the price in BAAC that the generator is paid is $40. Price that load pays in BAAB is $10. So I'm having a hard time kind of trying to understand how generation is flowing from a high-priced area to a low-priced area.
So I understand your concern, I understand your concern. As I said, this was just trying to illustrate what could have happened if you had counterflow. I did not, when I built this particular model, I did not build a network model. It was actually, we did the prevailing flow and someone had recommended we do a counterflow, and I did not change the prices. So what probably we would have had happen if I had had the opportunity and the time to do it, the pricing would have changed to be more what you expect of a lower price area going to serve, a lower price area to serve a higher price area. So I get your concern with the pricing.
Okay, thanks.
However, keep in mind that the exercise of the old contract through self-schedules does not necessarily have to be economic.
No, I understand. So that's why I didn't talk about that 100. I was talking about the 400 that seems to be flowing for the other point.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, James. Any other questions online or in the room? Doesn't look like it. Okay. So it looks like we have enough time to actually go through an additional example that we provided through an addendum. So if everybody's in agreement to go through another example, we'll walk through that and then we'll do our sort of final overall wrap up and Q&A. Okay. There's a question that's come in from Rohan.
Hey, Rohan from Pacific Corp. I think the question applies to both the prevailing flow and the counterflow examples, which is I'm looking to get some confirmation that in the transitional approach that was in the issue paper, am I correctly understanding that TBC OAT is calculated based on the marginal energy cost? However, in the revised proposal, TBC OAT is being calculated based on the marginal cost of congestion in either BA.
No, it's the TBC OAT is settled on the marginal energy costs under all circumstances. Under the prevailing encounter related to the transmission, the OAT contract is the generator, let's say in BAB, the generator was charged or settled at $10. And that is $20 marginal energy cost and a minus $10 of marginal cost of congestion. The TBC OAT is going to settle at $20, which is the marginal energy cost. So in BAB, that OAT transaction has a collection of congestion revenue from the generator of $1,000 as compared to an OAT transfer of $0. So that's why we are going to we're going to calculate what that hedge is, which is $1,000. We will give that to the entity so the entity can make the determination of providing it through their Tier 1 allocation. But the transfer itself is still settling at the marginal energy cost.
Okay, got it. So for BAB, the congestion revenue of $1,000 in the revised proposal is being calculated as a net of TBC OAT and the generation OAT.
Yes. That's the
Okay,
comparison.
got it.
So as part of, so to help with that is when we do the balancing of contracts from a settlement perspective, I am balancing by contract by BAA. So that's why I need to take into consideration the transfer megawatts because I have to know that the generator is going to a specified location that's associated with that contract. In this case, it's the transfer. I now see a supply of 100 megawatts, and for that BA, it's a demand of 100 megawatts in the form of a transfer. And so now I have a balanced quantity of 100 megawatts. I will calculate what the congestion difference between those 2 points, and that is what goes back to that's what goes to the entity in order to provide a hedge for that OAT customer.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thanks, Rohan. So let's move to the addendum example. And this is a separate document, I believe, that's posted and available on the initiative webpage as well. And we have it projected here. So go ahead, James.
Well, this one I think you guys will like because the prices are more consistent. The energy dispatched is basically done by a solver we created offline, and so it was mainly directed to address additional requests that was put into the comments. The comments requested for a wheeling transaction, a transfer constraint that was binding, as well as an import or export schedule that is going to and from a non-EDAM BAA. So we go next slide. So I'm going to level set this network model. Instead of doing 4, we did 3. So we have 3 BAAs. in each BAA, we have defined the nodal locations as well as the constraints that between the nodal locations. For BAB, I'm going to make the assumption that the import is priced at the nearest generation location. For the import, I have it going into BAB, so the closest generator was the generator B. I didn't set up a separate nodal model for the import, so I had to make a few assumptions. For BAC, I have an export that's going to a non-EDM BA, so I price it as a demand. So it'll have the same pricing as a load within that balancing authority area. All the BAs pass the resource efficiency evaluation test. In this scenario, BAA, which is the blue BA, has a constraint that is binding, and it's binding from a physical congestion perspective. That's FA12. That's going to go, it's going between generator A1 and generator A2. It has impacts based on the distribution factors or contributions throughout the footprint. I do also have a BAB's transfer constraint is binding in the import direction. So at some point when we hit that binding constraint, generation within BAA, which is less or more expensive than generation outside, is going to have to be dispatched to meet that internal load because I can't get any more transfers in. There's transmission customers have submitted balanced self-schedules. In BAC, I have 125 megawatts of supply at GC2. That 100 megawatts of supply is associated with a CRN that is for an export at BAC of 25 megawatts, as well as a transfer between BAC and BAB of 100 megawatts. Within BAB, I also have a transmission customer who has submitted balanced self-schedules. It could be the same transmission customer, it could be different, but there is an association at the transfer location. It'll have a 100 megawatt import transfer from BAC that is going to go and serve 100 megawatts of load within BAB, but I also have 25 megawatts of OAT import self-schedule that is serving 25 megawatts of load in BAB. So under both circumstances, I have 125 megawatts of supply, meaning 125 megawatts of load. And so the overall transactions are balanced. Now, the export and import are not necessarily associated. I just put the numbers for convenience for me. So now, we turn the next page. We see that the model solved, and I'm going to go through this a little bit. Because the transfers were not binding between BAA and BAC, their marginal energy cost is the same, so it's $35 each. However, since BAB is limited in the transfer on the import direction, we had to dispatch more generation within that BAA. So its marginal energy cost was $48.19. So I have a $13.19 differential between BAB and the corresponding BAA and BACs, the marginal energy cost. Within BAA, I had that binding constraint at FA12. Its shadow price was $15.32. So now, based upon the effectiveness of these various generation and load on that constraint, you're going to have different marginal cost of congestion impacts across the footprint. Now, I didn't put what the actual pricing is. What I did put is what the dollar settlements were. So for generator A1, it was dispatched for 203 megawatts roughly. And so the LMP settlement for it was a payment of $6,094.15. Of that LMP settlement, there was a charge for $1,015.69. For generator A2, it was a payment of $5,874.47 with a charge of $734.31 in congestion associated with FA12. Load, there was no congestion. It was complete, there wasn't any effectiveness on this particular load. So the marginal cost of congestion price was zero. So it settled 300 megawatts at the marginal energy price. So it had to pay $10,500. Now I do have 50 megawatts going from BAA to BAB. That's at its limit. So I'm exporting out 50 megawatts to BAB, and so I do have to do a charge from a marginal energy perspective of $1,750. In BAB, actually I'm going to jump down to BAC because that's the other BA that's not binding. BAC, I have 180 megawatts dispatched from generator 1. It's, oh, I do a sign convention issue there. So I apologize. I should have had a parentheses around generator C. So that should be a payment of $6,012.75 with congestion exposure of $287.23 in BAA. And that's a carryover. So that should be zero in BAB. My cells didn't work right. So I apologize. So for generator 2, I had OAT transaction of 125 megawatts that was being self-scheduled to serve load in BAB. It got payment of $4,148.93 with a congestion exposure of $226.06. Generators C2 also had additional economic dispatch of 95 megawatts. It was paid $3,153.18, so has congestion exposure of $171.81. Load within that BAA was charged $9,989.33. It has a congestion exposure of $510.64. The export, which settled at the same pricing, had a 25 megawatt self-schedule OAT that is going to be charged $832.44 with a congestion exposure of $42.55. Now we're going to go to BAB. This is where all this energy is going. Because the transfer was binding, I had 150 megawatts of generation B that is serving its 300 megawatts of load, and it got paid $7,500. Of it, there's $271.28 of congestion. Generator B was not needed because the rest of that load was being served by OAT transactions or transfers. So my load OAT, which had 125 megawatts of self-scheduled load, was charged $6,237.70. That is a congestion exposure of $212.77. Load had an additional 175 megawatts of load served by 150 of it was generator B. The rest of it was coming from transfers from BAA, and so it was charged $8,731.38 with a congestion exposure of $297.87. There also is import settlement payment of $1,244 $1,244.68 with a congestion exposure of $39.89. The transfers settled at the marginal energy cost of $48.19. So it's an import, so there's a payment on the transfer accounting of $2,409.57 coming from A to B. And then from C to B, it's $3,614.36. Now, I'm going to do the summary, in essence, of the congestion revenue. If we go to the next slide. So the 300 megawatts of BAA generation to serve 300 megawatts of load, and as well as there's 50 megawatts of so it generated So it generates $366.48 of net congestion revenue for that transaction. I have 150 megawatts of BAB generation scheduled to serve 125 megawatts of BA load, but there's also 25 megawatts of BAC load that was also served. Now that generates $101.06 of net congestion rent. And the reason is it's counterflowing on the 100 megawatts of, 25 megawatts is counterflowing against the 100 megawatts of OAT transfer from BAC to BAB. I have 25 megawatts of OAT import scheduled to serve 25 megawatts of BAB OAT load. That's generating $2.66 of net congestion revenue. And then I have 125 megawatts of OAT generation in BAC serving 100 megawatts of BAB load and 25 megawatts of BAC OAT export. That generates $353.73 of net congestion revenue. With what's left over then is 300 megawatts of BAC generation serve 300 megawatts of load and exports. That generates $9.05 of net congestion rent. So how do we distribute it? What is the net value? The net value, if we go to the next slide, is $612.76. Yeah, next slide. You got it. Under the current EDAM tariff proposal, this would have gone all back to the BA where the constraint is modeled. In this case, it would have been BAA. Under the transitional measure, I would have calculated each of the BA's imbalance for congestion and distributed for that BA because that's where the congestion materialized. So I would have had some congestion where it was congestion revenue, some BA where it was congestion rents. Under the revised proposal, we're just considering the OAT transactions. This is the 100 megawatts of generation in BAC that was scheduled to meet 100 megawatts of load in BAB, as well as the 25 megawatts of generation in BAC to meet the 25 megawatt export in BAC, as well as the 25 megawatt import in BAB to serve the additional OAT load in BAB. Under those settlement, BAB receives congestion revenue of $172.88. That is the congestion difference between the 125 megawatts of load in BAB, the 100 megawatts of transfer, and then the 25 megawatts of import in BAB. For BAC, there is congestion revenue of $183.51. That's the difference between the congestion for generator in BAC that is serving the export in BAC as well as the transfer out of BAC. The remaining congestion, which is $256.37, is distributed back to the BA where the constraint was modeled. That's BAA. Now, if we go to the next slide. This is basically the same comparison I did in my 4BA example. The only difference is it's based on this network model. Under the current EDAM design, as I said previously, the $612.76 is distributed all to BAA. Under the transitional alternative, which was part of the issue paper, I would have had that $612.76 distributed based upon where that congestion was materialized. So we would have had BAA would have gotten $281.38. BAB would have gotten $199.47. BAC would have gotten $131.91. Under revised, it's a little bit shifted. So I would have $256.37 in BAA. I would have $172.88 for BAB. Those are associated with the OAT transaction. I get $183.51 in BAC associated with OAT transaction. And that would be given to the entity to apply through its Tier 1 allocation. I went through it quickly, so if you have any questions. I have one more slide afterwards to deal with transfer revenue, but I'd rather talk about congestion first.
Okay, I think we have a couple questions online. Seth, let's go ahead and start with you.
Quick question. I just have a quick question. This is Seth with CTO. I think I know the answer, but if you have a transmission right and you're counterflowing the constraint, so to speak, and so in other words, you probably would have been better off not having had scheduled your transmission right. Do you then owe money into the congestion allocation?
So if you were counterflowing and you're assuming you were charged for congestion or for that generation, or you're paid?
In this case, you would be, according to the LMPs, your source would be higher than your sink. So
yeah, so I would expect you to get paid. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Yeah, so under this design, that generator, because it's scheduling its OAT, it is saying that it doesn't want to settle at the full LMP. It wants to, in essence, settle at the marginal energy cost. So the balance portion between that generator and the subsequent demand, whether it's load or export, that portion would be reversed for that transaction. If it's a transfer, then it's going to be a full reversal. So if you were, let's say the marginal energy cost was $20, you were a generator that was additional $20 was what your payment was. By exercising your rights and saying you want to transfer that to serve load in another balancing authority area, you're saying you want to settle at the marginal energy price of $20. So the congestion would go back to the BAA of $20. And they would apply that appropriately to get you back to your marginal energy cost.
Mm-hmm. So you would basically be charged the congestion.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Dan, you're next.
Hey, Dan from TEA. So first, James, heavy lifting in an afternoon to go through all these numbers. And I apologize for maybe trying to make you think on the fly a little bit here, but if we were to take the offset distribution in the last row there and look at BAAB, got $173 there, and we go up to the diagram slide, 2 or 3 slides before that, and we look at the relationship happening within BAAB. What I'm trying to tease apart a little bit is the next thought of, okay, well, what happens when we run this through the 2-tier allocation, and how difficult would it be to expand any of these scenarios to maybe just try and split up generation ownership and load associated with native load from load associated with that export and kind of see who's getting what for that, what's that, $20-ish that are kind of missing from the constraint impact from A that in the new model end up staying with BAA.
Okay. So one of the things that is, and we'd have to, I possibly could do that, but what I would need to do is get some more, we'd have to talk offline, get more details. Because one of the things about exercising these contract rights is, same with ETCs and tours, is you identify the financial scheduling coordinator. This is the scheduling coordinator that receives the congestion edge. For the ETCs and tours, if you have two SCs that are scheduling it, one is going to get that hedge. So if I have a price differential of $2, and I'm going to determine which of those scheduling coordinators on that contract should receive that $2 hedge, it's going to be a similar type of concept. I'm expecting from an OAT perspective or the EDMBA's allocation on tier one as to if I've got $2 between this import and or this generator and load, you will have told or identify which of the customers should get that congestion hedge or what the distribution of that congestion has. So that would require some more discussion.
Yeah, I think that's an area where continuing to work through this with the BAs in the room as well is helpful. And I know you could look at that and say, well, that's I guess track 7 type work to work through in some workshops on implementation, but it really does inform the policy discussion here, because a standard network native load customer is used to having a stack of designated network resources, and in general is just having those resources dispatched to serve demand, and their network transmission rights within a defined area are just sort of sending that generation out to serve all the loads within it. When we move into this scenario, though, it becomes not just a choice of what are my least cost resources moving up my DNR stack from an energy cost, that then brings in where are they located, where are the constraints, and how's the congestion impacting that. And I am, I guess, hungry for more information on what the expectations are around self-scheduling designated network resources, how loads would be treated, whether there are reasons or incentives to think about doing as you do in the ISO and breaking up into some sub-lap and custom laps for different load aggregations. It just feels like there's a whole lot more detail that obviously I'm not asking you to build into this is complicated enough, but to think through how it actually gets down to impacting the customers that are, end of the day, they're either paying the transmission revenue requirement of the EDM BA TSP through buying long-term firm transmission, or they're paying it in their monthly or yearly based network transmission charges. And I think until you get down to that level of connection, it's really hard to say that something is providing a fair hedge ultimately to the entities that are funding the transmission system. And it just ties back to the discussion that Steve and Avram and George and you and others had kind of throughout the day of the difference between kind of the CRR model and how things are set up now for EDM, based more around use than around investment in the system. And the fun thing for me with TEA is that we both hold firm point-to-point transmission rights. We work with entities who hold firm point to point, and we work with entities who are NT customers. So we're just looking to better understand the fairness across all the different types of affected entities.
Okay, I appreciate that, and then as we can have more discussions on it, but one thing I want you to see in here is, I was trying to demonstrate in BA, is if that load has, I think you said it can come from a series of supply, that could be in your BA or outside your BA. The nuances of using a contract reference number is we can associate multiple generations to that load. And when you come into the market, you can designate which of those resources are actually serving your load, and therefore will balance across all of those generations to serve that load. So if I had 300 megawatts of load to be served and I want it to come from generator B1, generator GC, and generator GC2, 1 and 2, I can designate this is the amount of CRN that's coming from them, and then I'll self-schedule how much I need from them. So you can't have many-to-one associations between the load and the supply that's serving it.
Yeah, and I guess we need to link over then to sort of how the EDM BAs are looking at that within their own tariff/business practices, and the ability for an entity to say, I'm a network customer of Pacificor. I have generators here, here, and here, and I have loads in different areas. Am I getting contract reference numbers related to my network rights that allow me to associate gen with specific loads, or is my load just considered one weighted point within the larger BA? My generators are all on the same contract reference number, and I'm just sort of getting the average of all activity within the BA.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Dan. Doug, did you have a comment or question? Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, this is Doug Boccignone for BAMX. I just wanted to respond to what Dan just said. I think this mechanism that ISO is proposing will give the host BAAs the information they need and the revenues they need to keep both the point-to-point and the network customers whole, as long as the schedules are made using the contract reference number. So I think it seems like this framework will set up so that the money is there to fund and provide the benefits of those network and point-to-point rights, and it's up to the host BAAs to make sure they set up a mechanism so your contract reference numbers model the sources and the sinks appropriately, and as long as the customers use them, it should work. As long as the source and sink nodes are settling at the same points and the same prices as what's flowing through, it'll be okay.
That's right. This is Milos with the ISO. Thanks, Doug. I was going to jump in and note something similar. That's right. This design will allocate those proper amount of revenues back to that entity to be able to suballocate it to those NITs and point-to-point customers that are exercising those rights associated with the CRNs. I think Dan's point is well taken. I think we can support the entities in their discussions on how they're setting up these CRNs and the different transmission rights, but that's, I think, a little bit separate from and independent from this design, which is really intended to allocate sufficient revenues to those entities to be able then to provide that more direct hedge. I just don't want to leave the impression here that we have to resolve all of those different allocations, in order for this design to move forward. This design really just intends to get the right amount of money back to the entities to be able to sub-allocate, and I think we'll continue to support Pacificor and others in those discussions as they get to it, to support, the ultimate CRN establishment, which will come down, and then the exercise of those CRNs to be able to provide that allocation back to the entity. But your point is well taken, Doug. Sufficient enough revenues under this proposal will flow back to the entity to be able to provide that hedge for parties exercising those owed rights.
All right, thanks, Doug. So I think on that one example, we will make a couple of corrections that I think James highlighted on that graph, and we'll repost that so that the corrected document is available to you. All right, any other questions on this final example? Or I can just open it up for questions now for any outstanding questions, comments, feedback on the overall proposal before we wrap up. You have something else?
Yeah, I had one more slide at the end.
Oh, sorry, I missed a slide. One more slide.
Transfer revenue.
Jumping in. Okay, thank you, James.
Yeah, I didn't want it to cloud the congestion revenue discussion with transfer revenue discussion. So, as I said previously, BAB's net transfer constraint was binding in the import direction. What it meant was that BAB had to dispatch a higher price resources within its balancing authority area because it couldn't get the cheaper resource from external. And so what ends up happening is for the transfers between BAA and BAB and the transfer between BAC to BAB, that's 50 megawatts and 75 megawatts respectively, it's going to generate transfer revenue. And what the transfer revenue is going to be based upon the marginal energy cost differences between BAB and the subsequent other BAs, BAA and BAC. So in this table to the left, I'm calculating what the LMP settlement is in this case and determining what the transfer revenue is for each of these transfers. You got transfer from A to B. I had a charge for the export of $1,750. I have a payment for the import of $2,409.57. That means we have a transfer revenue settlement of $659.57. All of the other transfers were not being utilized. We weren't utilizing that direction. And then so when we have the transfer from C to B, it's a net transfer that I applied this to. And so I have BAB as a import transfer of 75 megawatts. So it's $3,614.36 payment. BAC is a charge of $2,624.99. That's a transfer revenue of $989.37. This is the amount of money difference between the two BAs for that energy transferring between the two BAs. So how is it distributed? It is distributed to those BAAs. In this case, is the default mechanism, which is 50-50. So the $659.57 is split evenly between BAA and BAB to be $329.79 each. For the transfer revenue for TCB, it is the $989.37 were split evenly. And then so BAB and BAC get $494.68 each as well. Now this is the transfer revenue. This is a payment to those BAAs, and it's for those BAs to distribute as they see appropriately. So what is the net? So for BAA, their net transfer revenue is $329.79. For BAB, because it had transfers coming from two other BAs, they get $824.47, whereas BAC gets $484.68. The total transfer revenue is $1,648.95. Do we have any questions? And I just want to add, the reason why I wanted to talk about this separately is we've done a separation from the congestion revenue and the transfer revenue. And so I wanted to make sure there wasn't an association being built about them. So they are handled separately.
What is important to show here and note is that for odd contracts or any kind of transmission contract that the source and the sink are in different BAAs, and there's a price separation between these BAAs because of transfer scheduling limits, the financial heads for the contract is for the two legs from the supply to the transfer point and from the transfer point to the demand, but it does not include the transfer revenue that is collected for the difference in the prices between the two BAAs, unless the SC has some agreement to receive this transfer revenue or their share of the transfer revenue directly from their EDM entity, because the ISO distributes the transfer revenue to the entity and not to any specific transmission service provider or the financial scheduling coordinator that represents those contracts. So keep that in mind.
And I believe the EDM entity's OAT is addressing how that transfer revenue associated with transmission customers have exercised their rights versus all other transfer revenue is being distributed. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I know that it is in their OAT.
All right, questions, Steve?
Yeah, I want to follow up on that exactly. If we assume that the two BAAs are not the CAISO, so it's that somebody has an OAT from the generator to the transfer point, and then the transfer point to the load in the other one. They should get basically those should be able to be put together as a full hedge, correct? Because you would, basically they could schedule, that they don't care about what the prices at the transfer points are. They schedule their load from the generator to the transfer point and then take that same amount of generation at the transfer point and schedule it to load. I can't do the math fast enough, but did you look to see whether with the transfer revenue as it's done, there would be sufficient in each of those areas to provide them with, for the EDAM entities to provide that customer with the full hedge?
Yeah, so from a transfer revenue perspective, the way to look at it is the marginal energy cost of the load that is being served and the generation or supply that is using, that is what has to be a hedge for. Now we've broken it up into two. One is what represents the energy difference is being calculated at the transfer. So it is already included in the collection and settlement of the generation and load. We're just using the transfer location to determine what that value is. And so there should be enough congestion or revenue from an energy settlement to allow for this payment to go out. Because when I look at it from a footprint perspective, I will be neutral from energy.
So there's still sufficient revenue collected to pay the entire heads. It's the specific mechanism that has two parts. The ISO part pays the financial scheduling coordinator for the contract directly for the two legs up to the transfer and from the transfer location. And then The transfer revenue is given to the entities, and the entities can pay the transmission customer for that piece of the hedge. So if you add all the three pieces together, you have a full hedge.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, Dan, online?
Yeah, just super quickly at the end of the day here. One clarification just on the last line of question that we had that Doug commented on. There definitely was $20 in, however you want to term it, underfunding within BAAB. And so the apportionment between different types of customers, generation owners, load, exports, imports, et cetera, definitely does matter. And I'm frankly am surprised that it has not been a larger point of discussion for then what that means inside the BAs. But even if NT customers self-schedule, they still are not getting proportional value relative to what they're paying for the transmission system. But I did want to say thank you also for these transfer revenue distribution examples. Though it still remains clear how entities that today hold a long-term firm point-to-point, or especially a network right, where the impact of those rights as being internal transmission versus being transfer transmission, sort of where one stops and the other starts. It feels like we're talking about it like you're going from one room to the next, and the transfer is the hallway in between. But I think the rights generally are for somewhere close to the couch, halfway to the kitchen, and it isn't as clean as what it feels like we're talking about it. Or maybe we just need more clarity when actually looking at a transmission system and using some example rights with example POR, POD impacts.
No, thanks, Dan, for that. Yeah, I mean, I think we can consider that, but that's I think we're trying to illustrate this more broadly. I understand that once we get to this phase of modeling the different transmission rights, I think there'll be discussions between the transmission rights holders and the EDAM entity of translating and registering those rights. I think that's the right place, but yeah, I mean, there may be some nuances on different types of transmission rights that parties hold, and what are those POR, POD locations. But I think we're trying to illustrate here just the concept of your transmission rights when you're exercising them from defined, modeled source sink locations, that the design is intended to provide sufficient congestion revenues back to the entity to hold that, to provide that hedge, based on how those rights are modeled and registered in the market. So I do recognize there may be some nuances on registering rights, but I think we can work through that in the discussions that are coming in the different tracks for registration. But
I get that. I'll let you wrap up, but we don't. If the examples don't represent any sort of reality of the way that the energy market schedules or rights are held or anything, they aren't as useful as examples. Sometimes, like, you actually have to go into the weeds to see if something is going to work. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, Steve? Oh, you're good. Okay. So let me check with the team here. Any other final comments or slides before I jump the gun again? No? We're all good? Okay. John?
Yeah, one quick comment. James, you said on some of your examples you have some math or some things to change.
Yeah.
You'll update those?
Yep,
and
we'll
send them out?
update
Perfect.
that
Thanks.
and we'll repost those corrected slides for you. All right, so I think we can move to final Q&A.